Chapter 14 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton Dean. Chapter 14. An unrecorded incident of mounted police history. The Crooked Lakes Affair. On the evening of February 20th, 1884, I was requested to go to the commanding officer's quarters, and there I met Mr. Hayter Reed in conference with Superintendent Herchmer. The Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories, who was also Commissioner of Indian Affairs, had gone away on leave and had appointed Mr. Hayter Reed, the Assistant Commissioner of Indian Affairs, to be administrator during his absence. Mr. Reed had been an Indian agent at Battleford in the days when Superintendent Herchmer had been stationed there in command of the Mounted Police Post, and a close friendship had sprung up between them. Mr. Reed was thus at this time administering the affairs of the country, and his word was law. On the line of the Canadian Pacific Railway, about 80 miles east of Regina, is a place called Broadview, and about 10 miles north of the village, as it was then, was an Indian reserve. A report from the local Indian Department officials had just been received by the administrator that about 60 or 70 Indians had broken into the government storehouse, had threatened the life of the farm instructor, a Mr. Keith, and had stolen some 60 or 70 bags of flour and bacon. Mr. Reed's mission was able to ask that a posse of police be sent to the spot to look into the matter. It was finally settled that I should go in charge of 10 men, who were not to take their arms. They would take their side arms, of course, but not their carbines. A freight train was due to pass Regina at 9:45 o'clock next morning, and we went to the station to catch it, but it did not come until 3 p.m., and it was 9 p.m. when we reached Broadview. We had had very sketchy meals during the day, so supper was the first consideration, and teams and bobsleighs were ordered for 10:30 p.m. I then went to see Mr. Dodd, who was the resident J.P., and had a chat with him. He was very pessimistic and advised me not to go out to the reserve with so few men, but I said it was my duty to go, and that I should assuredly do so. It seemed that Mr. Keith had been in Broadview expecting us to arrive earlier in the day, but had grown tired of waiting and had gone back to the reserve. He left a message with Mr. Dodd to the effect that the matter was very serious, that the Indians were armed and had sworn to shoot the first man who attempted to arrest one of them. He quoted Mr. Mackenzie, a trader living on the reserve and doing business for the Hudson's Bay Company, as saying that the Indians were uglier than any Indians he had ever seen. We were fated not to reach the reserve that night, for it presently transpired that the only procurable horses were tired after a day's work which they had already done, and that the guide who was to show us the way to the farm buildings was by no means sure of the road. Considering that Mr. Keith had not thought it necessary to wait for us, I concluded that there was perhaps no desperate need of haste, and ordered the teams for 7:30 the next morning. Before going to bed, I wired an epitome of the local opinion to Superintendent Herchmer. It was clear and calm when we started the next morning, with the snow rather deep and the thermometer about 30 degrees below zero. Travelling was slow, and we did not reach the farm until 9:30 a.m. Mr. Keith then secured some jumpers for the further progress of the party on account of the deep snow, and it was 10:30 before we fairly got under way. We were, of course, entirely in Mr. Keith's hands, and his idea was to visit each of the minor chiefs and to ascertain where his Indians were to be found. Fortunately, he had provided a very competent interpreter, a full-blooded Indian named Gaddy, who had the reputation of being honest enough and independent enough to interpret correctly without fear or favour. He could, moreover, understand and interpret good English. The first minor chief that we visited was named Little Child, and was at home. He was almost blind and had no taste for frivolities. He said he was sorry the young men would go in for dancing instead of working. His good example seemed to have impressed the rest of his band, for only one of them was implicated in the current disturbances. We had here to wait for a guide to be procured, because we had to break our own trail, and it was necessary in the few hours of daylight to make as many short cuts as possible. We made a meal on some grub that we had brought with us, and then headed for Yellow Calf's house. He was the chief of the combination, had raised a fairly good crop, and was supposed to be loyal. We found his flag flying, but no one at home save squaws. From thence we proceeded to Acouse's, whose squaws were at home, but no one else. At 5 p.m. we went down to the valley, and in course of time came to the house of a half-breed named Jacob Bear. There we came across the most astute Indian of the whole tribe, named Osoup. It was uncertain how far he gave the other Indians the assistance of his sympathy, but no overt act had ever been traced to him. He was in fairly good circumstances, dressed respectably, was a good hunter, and talked intelligible English. From him we learned that the Indians, some 60 or 70 in number, were in a house close to the river. Also, he offered to take us to the place. I asked him if he would tell the Indians that I was there and should like to have a talk with them, and that I should like to take with me Mr. Keith, Sergeant Bliss, and the interpreter. He returned with a message that the Indians were willing that I should as I had proposed, and then I sent the rest of my men back to the farm. We had driven about 25 miles in the junipers, and it was 7 o'clock, time for a meal if there had been one in sight, which there wasn't. The house which we were about to enter was a substantially built log house, with one door facing the east and one small window facing the south, a one-roomed house measuring about 30 feet by 18 feet. An oblong excavation from 18 inches to 2 feet deep had been made in the centre, and the Indians were sitting around this oblong, with others standing behind them. The place was literally packed with Indians, and it was as much as we could do to find standing room. However, we eventually did so, and I stood at the northwest corner of the dugout, which was a convenient place for speaking from. When I first went in at the door I stepped, of course, into the evacuation, not being able to see it and not knowing it was there, and very nearly came a cropper, at which there was a general guffaw. Without wasting any time, however, I told the Indians that I was very glad to have the opportunity of talking to them, that complaint had been made that a large number of Indians had broken into the government warehouse, had threatened the life of the farm instructor, and had stolen a great many bags of flour and bacon, and the Great White Mother had sent me to ask them what they had to say about it. I said, "The Great White Mother is very sorry to hear that her Indian children have done this wicked thing. She keeps a store of food on the reserve so that her Indian children shall not starve. She gives them of this food every 2 or 3 days, and expects that they will be content with what she gives them, without money and without price. She feels quite sure that her Indian children would not have stolen her goods unless some bad men had put bad thoughts into their hearts, and she expects that those Indians who led the others in this bad act will give themselves up to be tried in her court in the same way as white men are tried when they break the Queen's law." That, and much more to the same effect, through more than 2 weary hours. Each sentence was interpreted as it was uttered, and while the interpreter was doing his part, I was thinking out the next sentence in words of one syllable as nearly as possible. 3 Indians replied in speeches of some length, and said that promises had been made to them by the Indian Commissioner which had not been kept, and that the Assistant Indian Commissioner had cut down their rations in a manner which constituted a breach of faith. They argued also that they helped themselves to the flour and bacon because they were hungry. I thought a good deal more of the Indians' complaint then than I do now, for the burden of the Red Man's song is always grub, grub, more grub. These rascals had been dancing for 13 days straight on end, and had neglected even to go and draw their rations. Hence the occasion for the theft. I told them that I would tell the Indian Department what they said, and advise them, if they seriously intended to attempt to explain their conduct by the representation that they were hungry, to show their good faith by giving up the leaders of the raid to be tried by the courts. They replied that they would talk it over, and if I would stay there overnight they would give me an answer in the morning. There was no place that I knew of wherein I could stay for the night, and having had nothing to eat since midday, I decided that I had better go back to the farm. So I told them there might be some messages there for me which might require an answer, and that it was necessary that I should go. The Indians were perfectly respectful and friendly from first to last. There was one, and only one, who meant to be offensive. He asked me as I was going out of the door what the police were going to do about his horses which he had lost some time previously. His tone and manner were distinctly impertinent, and I made him answer a good many questions, asking finally if he had reported to the police that he had lost his horses. He said no, and I retorted, "How did you expect the police to know that your horses were lost if you did not tell them?" An approving "Ugh" behind me indicated that at least one of my hearers had a logical mind, and under cover of it I went out into the night. We had talked from 7 to 9:15 p.m., and it was 11 o'clock before we reached the farm. I found there a telegram from Herchmer to say that he and 10 more men were on the way. He arrived the next day in the forenoon, having brought no arms, and about 1 o'clock we all started for the house in the valley. Colonel MacDonald, Indian Agent, also arrived in his own cutter and preceded us. The Indians, of course, were watching us, and knew exactly what was going on. When we came in sight of the house, we could see that there were a number of armed Indians round about it. Some had shotguns and some had Winchester rifles, but every Indian present had a firearm of some sort. As Colonel MacDonald was driving up to the door, the men who were standing there sternly waved him off. They made the same signs to us, but we took no notice of them, and the entire party got out of their respective sleighs. Herchmer was very impatient. Colonel MacDonald, who had not spoken to the Indians at all, wanted to talk, but Herchmer would have none of it. He told me to fall the men in, and I did so. Then he said, "You'd better draw pistols," and I gave that order also. Instantly the heels of a butt was applied to the window sash, which fell out with a crash, and the cavity bristled with muzzles. Indians simultaneously appeared around the corners of the house, all having arms and all being ready to shoot. Finding remonstrance useless, Colonel MacDonald whipped up his horse and drove off, saying, "I'll have nothing to do with it." Herchmer and I were 2 or 3 paces between our line of men and the house when, without warning me of what he proposed to do, Herchmer suddenly said, "Well, I suppose we'd better go right in," and started off by himself. Everyone who knew Billy Herchmer knew that, whatever his failings were, lack of courage was not one of them, and he presumed that bluff would carry the day, as it had previously answered his purpose in the north. He had not made allowance for a band of Indians who were strangers to him, and were, as Mr. Mackenzie had told me, very determined. In the north he had been accustomed to deal with the Crees, but the Indians with whom we were now dealing were Saulteaux, who were always looked upon as a rather superior race. A young fellow named Jim Holford, consumed with curiosity, had, as we learned afterwards, followed our sleighs on horseback into the valley, but an Indian had warned him to go back, saying if there was going to be any fighting he would be killed with the rest of us. He took the advice and went. Herchmer had taken no more than a couple of paces towards the door when a big, fine-looking and determined Indian who was guarding the door presented his double-barrelled shotgun full in his face at a distance of something like 2 feet. Herchmer stopped dead, as in my opinion he was well advised to do, for there was certain murder in the dusky ruffian's eye. The other Indians followed his example, and we were all covered. A moment on the part of any one of us would have precipitated a climax. As the seconds passed without any ulterior act, it became evident that it remained with ourselves to force the situation or not. I do not know what Herchmer proposed to do in the house, even supposing the Indians had admitted us all. We had no warrant to arrest anyone, no information had been laid, and neither of us knew who the guilty parties were. Thus, from a criminal point of view, we had no locus standi whatever. We were in effect provoking the Indians to commit wilful murder by threatening to thrust ourselves into premises into which we had no right to force our way without the Queen's warrant. If disaster had befallen us, as for 2 or 3 seconds seemed extremely probable, our blood would have been upon our own heads. Presently Herchmer called for Yellow Calf, the chief, who persuaded the big Indian to lower his gun, and talk became once more the order of the day. The big Indian was not easily appeased. His blood was up, and he wanted to pull the trigger at some one of the men. I could not tell which one, nor why he wanted to shoot, but I thought he would do some mischief, and Yellow Calf thought so too, for he held on to the gun for some little time. It is to be remembered that up to this time no shot had ever been fired in anger between the police and the Indians, and a very grave responsibility would thus rest upon any person who should initiate hostilities. At this juncture the Indian agent reappeared, and an adjournment was made to Usopp's house, a little way off, where a prolonged powwow was held. The Indians, however, were no longer in the complacent mood of the evening before. They had hardened their hearts, and resolutely refused to give up the offenders. An arrangement was made providing that the administrator should be sent for, and we wended our way back to the farm, where we arrived about 8 p.m. Hayter Reed arrived on the following afternoon, and the Indian agent was dispatched to invite the Indians to a conference at the farm next morning. He stayed with them all that night, and eventually succeeded in inducing them to come and talk matters over. At about 9 a.m. on February 25, Usopp, Yellow Calf, and some others, escorted by armed and mounted braves in full war paint, duly arrived, and the whole forenoon was spent in talk. The administrator said after a time that he would like to talk to some of the young men themselves, and after some difficulty they were persuaded to come, very nervous and fearful of treachery. Late in the afternoon, after an eloquent speech from Usopp, Interpreter Gaddy said it was the finest speech he had ever heard an Indian make. 4 Indians named Yellow Calf, Kanawos, Moise, and Pennypakesis consented to go to Regina for trial, and we all took the night train thither. The trial took place on February 28th before Colonel Richardson, stipendiary magistrate, and Kanawos, Moise, and Pennypakesis were charged with larceny. Yellow Calf was not included in the indictment, as he was not concerned in the raid, and had moreover kept the peace on the previous day. Mr. A. E. Forget, now Senator, Clerk of the Legislative Assembly, appeared on behalf of the accused, who pleaded guilty and made a strong plea for mercy on account of the Indians' ignorance of the white men's laws. The Indians were convicted and discharged on suspended sentence. It was practically understood from the first that this was to be the outcome of the trial. When the court rose, Colonel Richardson called Herchmer and me into his room and said, "What were you gentlemen doing there without a warrant?" My answer was easy. I simply obeyed orders which I received from my superior officer. Herchmer's answer was not so easy, and he said nothing. All this, looked at from any point of view, was a very unfortunate occurrence. The police had made a faux pas, and had lost in a great measure their most valuable asset, their prestige. The story was naturally noised about among the Indians, and there is no doubt that it contributed somewhat to the turbulent spirit which manifested itself among the Battleford Indians later in the same year. So far as the Government was concerned, the matter was promptly hushed up. Herchmer never made any allusion to it in any of his reports. I wrote the report which Hayter Reed sent to his department, and he struck out of it all reference to the complaints made by the Indians that they were starving. There were in those days only 4 newspapers in the whole of the North West Territories, that is, the Leader at Regina, Fort Macleod Gazette at Macleod, the Saskatchewan Herald at Battleford, and the Bulletin at Edmonton. I never saw any account of the trouble in any of these papers until October 1887. The Edmonton Bulletin published an editorial on the subject. It was used as a vehicle to attack the Lieutenant Governor, the Assistant Indian Commissioner Herchmer himself, and his brother, who had been in 1886 appointed to the Commissionership of the Mounted Police. Thus it will be seen that the story took rather more than 3 years and a half to filter through to Edmonton from Broadview. The Indian Department in those days had some very persistent critics in Parliament who did not think it necessary by any means to confine themselves to the truth in making virulent attacks upon the departmental officials. It may be imagined, therefore, how careful the latter were to conceal anything which could be used to their discredit by their unscrupulous enemies in the opposition. The editorial to which I have alluded closed in the following words: "Bad management has been succeeded by worse, and bad precedent by still worse, until the force which was the pride of Canada and the safety of the North West has been made a laughing stock for the very men who a few years ago held it most in respect." I could, if I chose, write a great deal on the subject from this aspect, but as I have set out to write nothing of which I have not a personal knowledge, I refrain. I can only say that in the interval between October 1st, 1887, and the time at which these lines are written, nous avons changé tout cela. There is now living only one white man who knows all the particulars attending the émeute at Crooked Lakes, Mr. Mackenzie, to whom I referred. He kept a small trading establishment on the Reserve, and was in the confidence of the Indians. It was suggested to me that I should submit my narrative to Mr. Mackenzie and ask him whether his recollections agreed with mine. I judged it highly expedient to do so, knowing how often I myself had grown tired of hearing tales current in the North West which were more or less figments of the imaginations of the narrators. I received in return from Mr. Mackenzie a long letter, and afterward a very kind intimation. "You are at liberty to make any use of my letter that you see fit." The following is an excerpt from the letter referred to: "I have a very vivid recollection of that very regrettable and unwarranted disturbance at Crooked Lakes in 1884. Your story and review of all the details is most complete, faithfully portrayed, and in accordance with the facts as they actually took place. I was in charge of the Hudson's Bay Company's trading post on the Crooked Lakes Reserve continuously some years prior and subsequent to the 1884 trouble. I grew up with all those young men implicated, knew every soul on all the reserves personally, spoke the language, and was conversant with the daily circumstances of each individual family. It is a long story, with which you are no doubt conversant, how the Plains Indians were being gathered together at and prior to that time by the Government, and being placed on different reservations. Crooked Lakes, being one of the largest, received the greatest number of Indians, and of course in those days had to be fed regularly or rationed regularly. The reducing of these rations from time to time to practically nothing in the hard winter of 1884, when there were no rabbits or anything else to hunt for food, brought these Indians face to face with actual starvation. In some cases children died of starvation during that month, their mothers not being able to suckle them from their weakened condition, from lack of even partial nourishment at this critical period. Mr. Reed further instructed Mr. H. Keith to reduce the rations still lower. I asked Mr. Keith for God's sake not to reduce their rations any lower, or there would certainly be trouble. He carried out Mr. Reed's instructions. A few more died. The Indians came and asked for grub, which they were denied, broke into the Government storehouse, threw out as much flour and bacon as they wanted, and threw Keith out on top of it. I ran up from my store in time to save Keith's life, took him away from them, and told him what a foolish mistake he had made. Before I got him to my store he took one of his fits which he was subject to, and remained unconscious for fully an hour. In the meantime the Indians were loading up their jumpers with flour and bacon, and making a general distribution to those present, and sending flour and bacon on to those who were too feeble to come after it, while the air was about 30 degrees below zero that morning. After they divided up the flour and bacon, they all came to my store, all of course very excited, but offered me no violence. Only some of my best friends among them said in a jocular way that they had come in to clean out my store also, as they wanted tea, tobacco, sugar, rice and currants, so that they would have one good feed before they all died of starvation. I told them not to touch anything, that I had been helping many of them a good deal all winter, and was very sorry for what they had done in a moment of excitement, through the foolhardiness of one of their young men, for which all the Indians would now be held responsible by the government, whose name was Big Ben Kitchie, Usopp's son. I gave them what they wanted, and they all went their way to prepare the feast, having plenty of grub for the time being for themselves and families, after which the young warriors repaired to the house in the valley in which you found them, and it was very lucky for the M.P. that day that the Indians had had a good feed, so that their tempers were somewhat cooled off by their stomachs being full, or there would not one of you ever have come out of that valley alive, hampered as you were with your buffalo coats, deep snow, and with only side arms. I shudder yet when I think of what would have occurred had a shot been fired, even by accident. There is many a slip betwixt the cup and the lip, and anyway, that great tragedy was averted by a bloodless battle. I am the only living white man to-day that was on the ground and was intimately and personally acquainted with all the details of this affair, which I reported to my company at that time, and received their thanks for the way I handled the Indians and prevented them from looting our stores by providing them gratuitously with small amounts of provisions on that deplorable and critical occasion. They were supplied with a more liberal ration after that time, and there was no further trouble on that score until the following spring, in March 1885, when the rebellion broke out at Duck Lake. End of chapter 14.